Chemical imbalances, neurotransmitters. That's what's behind depression, right? Not quite. Depression is not solely caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, and in today's video, I'm going to explain why. Hi everyone. You may have heard that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, but we now have some convincing scientific proof that that's not quite right, and that the long-standing hypothesis that depression is due to lower levels of serotonin is just flat out not true. So what I'm going to be talking about is what this means in terms of our understanding of depression and our understanding of how depression is treated. But before I get into that, just a couple of disclaimers to go over. I'm a registered psychologist in the province of British Columbia, Canada, and this video is for informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute or replacement for advice from your doctor or mental health professional. Now, with those things out of the way, let's start talking about depression and chemical imbalances. Now, there was a recent research study that was published in the Journal of Molecular Psychiatry in July of 2022. And that's led to a seismic shift in how people think about and talk about and understand depression. The study was conducted by a researcher named Joanna Moncrief and her colleagues at the University College of London. And the study was a special type of study. It was called a meta-analysis. And what a meta-analysis does is that it essentially combines the data and results of numerous scientific studies to generate a broader scientific conclusion that has much more power than any of the individual studies on their own. Now, a well-conducted meta-analysis, it's considered one of the most powerful forms of scientific proof or evidence that we have. It's kind of the gold standard of evidence. Now, what this meta-analysis, published in July 2022, found was that there was no association between the neurotransmitter serotonin and depression. Now, for decades, it was often assumed or even presented as fact that depression is caused by too little serotonin in the brain, which then led to the development of numerous different antidepressant medications that were aimed at increasing brain serotonin levels. The idea was that someone who was suffering from depression experienced depression because they didn't have enough of this neurotransmitter serotonin floating around in their brain. Therefore, these antidepressant medications that increase serotonin levels, what they would do is they would help restore the balance of serotonin and thus alleviate the depression. This led to a long-standing and widespread belief that depression is due to a chemical imbalance in the brain. And if you can just fix that chemical imbalance by addressing these neurotransmitters, then the depression will be resolved and everything will be good. Now, it would be great if it were that simple. However, for years, scientists and clinicians have questioned the serotonin hypothesis, raising doubts that the root cause of depression is simply due to reduced levels of one particular neurotransmitter. The reason is because we know that depression is multifactorial. And what that means is there are numerous factors that can play a role in the cause and maintenance of depression. And that goes far beyond just neurotransmitter levels in the brain. We know that depression is affected by biological factors, things like brain injuries, the effects of certain medications, clinical conditions like hypothyroidism or chronic pain, physical injuries, substance use, genetics. Those all play a role in depression. We know that depression is also affected by psychological factors like behavior patterns, social withdrawal, not getting enough exercise, not eating well, overworking, negative thought patterns, the tendency to think badly about yourself, the tendency to think negatively about the world, the future, those types of things more generally. Depression is also affected by situational factors, things like the loss of a loved one, stressors like losing a job or a child being sick, bullying, harassment, abuse, injustice. Those all play a role in the onset and maintenance of depression. So we've known for a long time that depression is not solely attributable to serotonin levels in the brain. The serotonin hypothesis has also caused damage in terms of the way people think about and understand depression. If you simply view depression as due to chemical imbalances in the brain, what that means is that there's nothing you can do about it, right? You don't have any control over it, and so you need to rely on something else, like medications, to correct that chemical imbalance. However, whenever I've talked to my clients about the notion of depression being caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, what I always point out is that life causes chemical imbalances in the brain. When you're feeling really good, different neurotransmitters are released in your brain, and that alters the chemical balance in the brain. Same with being really angry, really excited, really sad, really frustrated, really anxious. Human beings are more than just neurotransmitter soup floating around inside your brain. Now, you might be wondering if there hasn't been convincing scientific evidence that has proven the validity of this chemical imbalance causes depression idea, and if scientists and clinicians have been questioning the validity of this idea, why has it lasted so long? Why has it been so pervasive, and why do so many people believe it? Well, just like depression, it's multifactorial. I think it's partly due to marketing by pharmaceutical companies. Now, pharmaceutical companies spend a lot of money researching and developing antidepressant medications, and so it's important to them that once a medication has been developed, that people use it. So the pharmaceutical companies have gotten very good at promoting this idea that depression is due to a chemical imbalance in the brain, and so this particular medication helps restore that chemical imbalance, and this is what will help people recover from depression. It's a simple message to market. So they'll spend millions of dollars on advertisements directed towards the public, but also have pharmaceutical representatives visit doctors' offices to talk about the most new and fangled antidepressant medication and why it's superior with adjusting this neurotransmitter and that neurotransmitter to reestablish the chemical balance in the brain. They do this with glossy handouts and colorful graphs, and they provide the doctors with free samples that they can then give to their patients. So it's not just the public that hears the message about the chemical imbalance in the brain, but also physicians who hear about all of the most up-to-date pharmaceutical company-fueled research presented on glossy pamphlets and handouts over a catered lunch. Now, it's important to point out that I'm not saying that pharmaceutical companies are making this stuff up or making up the research or lying about the research results. Antidepressant medications can be very effective for treating depression in a number of people. There have been millions of people who have been helped and treated successfully with antidepressant medications. But there's also a substantial number of people who have been treated with antidepressant medications who haven't experienced benefit from the antidepressants. So if it was as simple as low serotonin equals depression, then everyone who takes these medications to increase serotonin levels should no longer feel depressed. But we know that's not the case. Additionally, there's a logical fallacy that's at work here. The idea is that if I'm feeling depressed and I take this medication that increases my serotonin levels, and I start to feel better after taking the medication, then it follows that my depression was caused by having too low levels of serotonin in my brain. By this same logic, if I have a headache and I take an aspirin, which relieves my headache, then does that mean that my headache was caused by not having enough aspirin in my body? No. You probably get the sense of how ridiculous that sounds, but for years, the same logic has been used to explain the mechanism by which certain antidepressant medications work. I don't think there's any clear consensus or understanding or clarity on exactly how antidepressants work to alleviate depression, but what we know is that it's not just simply a matter of increasing serotonin levels. The third main reason that I think we've been so invested as a society and as a medical community in this idea that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain is that it's a nice and simple explanation. And we like nice and simple explanations. The notion that I'm feeling depressed because of a chemical imbalance in my brain, it can be oddly comforting in that it means that if I can just take this medication to fix that chemical imbalance, then I'll feel better. And that would be great. But as I pointed out, depression is so much more complicated than that. It would certainly be a lot easier to just take a pill and feel better than it would be to have to change some unhealthy behavioral habits that I have, like not getting enough exercise, like drinking too much, spending all of my time playing video games in my basement, being alone. It's easier to take a pill than it is to change the way that I think about myself, the way that I think about other people, the way that I understand the world or anticipate what's going to happen to me in the future. It's easier for me to take a pill than it is to address my history of trauma or deal with the bullying I'm experiencing at work or altering this toxic and unhealthy relationship that I'm in. If we can ignore all of those psychological and situational factors and just distill depression down to neurotransmitters flowing through synapses in my brain that I don't have any control over, then in some ways it makes it a lot easier to accept and deal with depression. The big problem with all of this, though, is that if you believe that depression is solely caused by a chemical imbalance in your brain, aside from taking medications, it removes any sense of control that you might have in terms of overcoming your depression. After all, how do you alter the chemical imbalances in your brain? What can you do to change that? Seems like an impossible task. However, as I mentioned earlier, life causes chemical changes in your brain. And we know that there are things that people can do and there is some control that people have in terms of overcoming depression. The type of therapy that I do with my clients is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And it aims at changing behavior patterns and thought patterns to help a person overcome feelings of depression. It gives that person a greater sense of agency and control over how they're feeling, which is something that the chemical imbalance in the brain theory never did. And the amazing thing is that we can change our neurobiology. We can change what's happening in our brain through altering thinking patterns and through changing behavior patterns. And this is a process called neuroplasticity. So I hope the key message that you take away from today's video is that depression is so much more than neurotransmitter soup going on in your brain. Depression is multifactorial. There's multiple components and multiple factors that play a role in terms of a person experiencing depression. And there are a number of those factors that you can have some control over. You do have some control. You do have the ability to change how you feel. And for a lot of people, they just need to know how. And I've done a number of videos on skills and tools to help a person address symptoms of depression. And so if you're interested in learning more, I'd encourage you to take a look at some of those videos. I'd love to hear your questions or ideas or thoughts about this. So please leave me some comments in the comments section down below. If you've been enjoying my videos and would like to see more, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell, and you'll be alerted every week when I post a new video. So that's all for today's video. Thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.